All right, we're live. Hey, folks. I'm glad to talk with you on our live stream tonight. A couple of weeks ago, I put up a new video about emerging weather trends. I wanted to talk with you all a little more about that weather stuff and the implication, particularly for the area near and dear to my heart, the emerging growing stuff zone, or GSD. As we talk about areas of hope on this channel, areas where we really have a chance to build climate resilience, these precipitation trends show us some of the most important work we need to do in the area with the most globally positive outlook, the growing stuff zone, which let me make sure I've got this centered here. This map is terrible because I drew it. Minnesota, I'm sorry that I made you look fat. In Illinois, like this, it's wrong. It's wrong. But these are just some general broad stroke situations here where when we're talking about our areas with a real chance for agricultural increases in productivity, not just like maybe it could stay the same, but actual areas where we can optimize growth. We're going to be looking from like eastern Montana all the way over to the Great Lakes and then down into Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois, about to this line where Nebraska sort of gives us a handy cutoff point here. This whole area has some weather trends that have both positive and negative implications that we'll talk about. But, I often talk about the difference between emerging threats and current challenges that are getting worse. In this whole area, the only area with serious emerging threats is in the forests here as we start to get into kind of north central Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, between about Leech Lake and Brainerd. There's a potential for emerging wildfire, but that's the major challenge in the whole GSC. It's just fabulous. The rest of the big challenges we could be looking at, I'll talk with you more about them in this stream. They're more matters of intensification, changes in degree rather than changes in kind. And I think there are reasonable ways we can start building resilience to them. As we get going, I asked people to contribute questions kind of around this theme on the channel. And a question about polar vortexes definitely fits into the emerging GSD picture. We had someone write, could the winters be even colder here up in the upper Midwest, north of the 42nd parallel? Uh, and due to, say, polar vortex phenomena. And it's true, the science around that is confusing. And I can give you a one word answer, which is briefly we will see even colder winters potentially. Like today is getting incredibly cold. This is probably going to be the coldest Christmas in 40 years for many parts of the region. But the short term part of that is very important. So I'm going to give the answer now with many words. Where if we talk about the winters in the northern US, they are on trend to become milder. They certainly have become milder over the last 10 years. And they're on trend to become a little bit shorter too, with earlier thaws and later frosts. But when we do get a polar vortex, and that phenomena may well continue to occur because things are getting really weird up in the north, right? Our most extreme degree of change that's in the north, right? We do anticipate that's going to cause us to continue to get occasional bursts of extreme cold. The number of days of extreme cold across the emerging GSC, they have declined over the last few decades and they're likely to continue to decline. But that doesn't mean we're not going to experience any extreme cold. And if you've never been in a polar vortex, they are a thing to experience. I was in Chicago for a big one. When it gets cold enough in Chicago, they light the train tracks on fire so trains can keep running. And you know you're dealing with a fun weather phenomena when lighting the infrastructure on fire is therapeutic for that infrastructure. So they're pretty intense. If you're from the Southwest, if you're from the Southeast, it would be something unlike what you've experienced. And power demand is going to be very high during these brief, I want to emphasize it's brief, like 2 day long periods of intense cold. Having backup power sources is a very important way to build resilience in so many ways in this emerging region, from storm related disruptions. In case of heat related disruptions, I've talked a lot about how wet bulb temperatures are an emerging threat, particularly in the southern band here. We're going to be concerned about that in the GSC. And of course, in cold related disruptions, that's the classic case where you want to have backup power for resilience. There are some plant, living thing, agriculture related implications of having continued brief periods of extreme cold in the region that are worth thinking about if you're a person interested in permaculture, right? Because we're going to need trees that overall have lower chilling degree day requirements, but they will still need to be able to be pretty hardy to brief cold periods. Anything that's going to live in the ground, trees and shrubs, they have to be able to take it. But the cold periods we're talking about, they're not long enough to kill rootstock in most cases. So if you're talking about vines, you might have more tolerance in that situation. The soil is going to warm and chill slowly. The soil temperature is not going to be the same as the air temperature. So even though we're talking about extreme cold, we're talking about above ground impacts on living things primarily. And that means that what will get killed by these periods of extreme cold in the future, even if they are brief, are many species of invasive pests. The prediction that we will continue to have some extreme cold is part of why fire ants are unlikely to make it north of here, which is awesome because they're going everywhere else. Like they're going up into like Pennsylvania. It's really gross. Fire ants are horrible. But many species of invasive pests will be stopped by these short cold snaps. Some not so much. Like some serious invasive pests, like the emerald ash borer, does not care if it's as cold as Mars for like 3 days. They need a really deep and really extended cold period to kill them off, the emerald ash borer. But overall, across insect species, if we're getting some pulses of serious cold, for many of the insects that winter above ground, stay in plant stems and leaf litter, you have a chance there to see some of those invasive populations controlled. And that's good. For native insect populations, too, they get sort of the right hand of that same phenomena. The natives will be fine, they'll be encouraged by those cold bursts, and it'll suppress invasives. And that is one of our big emerging threats in this area is invasive insects and spread of fungi and mold that we're not used to. So, closing out this part of the discussion based on the viewer question, there will likely be some continued polar vortex activity. And while you will find the polar vortex experience unpleasant if you move here and you're not accustomed to it, they're likely to continue to be pretty brief, and you will find that no one likes them. This is not a thing where we like go out and we pretend we're really tough. Most places, most jobs, they don't want you to go out in the polar vortex. Schools close in extreme cold, so do many other buildings and places of work. If you're in the Southwest and you're thinking about moving up to this region, you shouldn't be concerned about the polar vortex experience. It shouldn't be something that makes you say, no, I can't handle it. You just got to come here and like adapt the culture of the place, which means staying inside and having a backup power solution. It should go without saying, but even in a weather emergency, you should never use a generator or a grill or a camp stove or something dumb like that in your house so you don't kill your family. But changing gears a little bit, I've talked before about how as we move through this century, we're going to be dealing with emerging challenges and with intensification of existing challenges. The GSC here, this is historically and today a region of very intense storms. We're talking about landscapes that see huge changes in annual temperature. It's very common to have temperatures in the summer up to 101, 102, although again, those are usually very brief, these super intense pulses, and we have temperatures that get well into the negatives. I'll use North Dakota as an example because everyone knows they're like the most extreme guy in the room. The coldest temperature ever recorded there in partial North Dakota was negative 60 F, and that occurred in the same year, 1936, as the highest North Dakota temperature. The 30s were really bad years for extreme weather. When we talk about climate impacts to 2050, the 30s are actually how we measure if it's going to be inside or outside of historical norms because the 30s were so bad. The highest temperature ever recorded in Iowa was in 1934, 118 degrees. And a lot of us have anxiety about wet bulb temperatures. It's worth noting we hit those temperatures. We hit them in the 30s. It sucked, but society did not melt, right? People find ways to go on, and we will find ways to go on as we move into the forward. As we're talking about existing challenges in the GSC as well as existing opportunities, it's important to consider that we're talking about a region where, because of these current extremes, the infrastructure is already built to handle bidirectional extreme temperatures. And there's a certain amount of living memory regarding very extreme heat and very extreme cold conditions. But the intensification of the precipitation in this region, it really may require some new approaches to infrastructure and pace of life as we move towards 2050. So I want to talk about the precipitation picture that's emerging. There's much more winter and spring precipitation in this region, serious drops in summer precipitation. And when I say more, I mean it, like another 10 in the winter with the wetter arc. You can see here I did it in blue. There's a wetter arc with 15+% more winter precipitation coming in sort of over the top of Minnesota. I'm sorry I made you so thick, Minnesota. I'm not a good artist. And through South Dakota is sort of the primary target of the increased winter precipitation. And then the top of Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois are looking at about a 10% increase in winter precipitation. In the spring, the whole region is in the same rain shadow. 15+% more precipitation is projected across the entire region. And that's a lot. We'll talk more about the technical challenges in just a second, but I want to offset these spring and winter gains by the fact that in the summer, we're looking at about a 5 to 10% drop in overall precipitation with longer intervals between rainstorms. There's an exception there. In the extreme northwoods of Minnesota here, kind of up above the emerging wildfire danger area, they are expected to hold their current summer precipitation. Fingers crossed that'll help save some of those unique forest environments. Overall picture though, even setting aside the longer, more intense periodicity of summer drought, there's a lot of water coming our way. And it's a lot of water coming right during an important time for traditional agriculture. We're going to get hosed by the spring precipitation right during the planting season. That's going to be a problem, and it's already been a problem. This year is good model year in many ways, 2022, for the sorts of weather patterns we're expecting to be stabilized as we move towards mid-century. We had a number of farmers in my community who really delayed their spring planting beyond the point of comfort. It just has been too wet to get out into the fields. And we have to remember as well, when we're thinking about these weather trends related to the extreme weather video, there is hail project increase, a pretty substantial increased projection for spring hail across the GSC, although the largest size increase is projected for Iowa and Nebraska, where we're going to be getting hail about that big, about 2 or 3 times a spring. So this increased spring precipitation, it's going to be nasty precipitation, leaning towards nastier, leaning towards the sort of precipitation that is going to have particularly devastating impacts on very young plants. And that suggests, all in all, right, a need to have some changes to our approach. If it's going to be difficult to get annuals in, if it's going to be difficult to put in annual crops, if they're going to get shredded by hail, it seems like it's safer to focus more on the end of growing season changes than the beginning of growing season changes for garden and crop production. We're projected to see earlier frost-free dates in the spring and later frost-free dates in the fall, but that fall extension is coming alongside much less dramatic weather trends. I'm at a stage in my permaculture journey and my gardening journey where I'm still learning. So I do things that are dumb sometimes. I'm still playing around. But this year in 2022, it has been useful as a preview year for the weather trends with this very wet spring, with the summer drought, with the extended growing season in the fall. And it's cool for me at the end of this year, end of this growing season, to reflect backwards and think about how that experience on the ground this year fits into the picture as we move into the next century. So I have a lot of perennial plants, including natives to the area, like ground cherry, blackberry, wild grape. I also have a lot of bulbs and biannual stuff like parsley, things that are going to come up on their own. I was finding this year that I was completely unable to extend the growing season for annuals. I couldn't pull them up any earlier. The soil was too cold. Even though it might have been frost free, the soil took a long time with everything being shaded with the rain. The sun didn't come down and warm up the soil until late. I couldn't even get cool season spinach going. I felt really lame. It was a bad scene. But my perennials, all of those came up on their own. They had a little bit of a slow start. The bulbs and everything came up slow, but by mid-May, they were fantastic. With all of the rain, we ended up having the best fruit year ever in established fruiting plants and perennial fruiting plants. And it might be worth noting that in the forests, it also was a pretty good nut year. This is the first year that I have seen chestnut laying on the ground where animals hadn't eaten them like immediately because there were so many of them. I found that it was not useful and may continue not to be useful to really push the start date for annuals. It was a waste of time and it was a waste of seed. But I found that I could really push the annual end date this year by like a lot, by like 4 weeks. Although we did have our first fall frost not far from our traditional first frost date, the frost was so mild that with very basic covering, such as you could easily do larger scale with hoop houses, which would also moderate your hail threat, I was able to keep everything alive until early November, which is unusual. The soil was so warm, that soil temperature is important, right? Everything just kept bouncing back, even tomato and eggplant under actual frost. It was wild. I was still picking new growth off of frost resistant stuff like herbs until December 14th this year. And I was picking chard and beet greens until mid November in big volumes, enough to feed the family out of the garden until mid November. As we move towards 2050, thinking about agriculture, thinking about the promise of the GSC, I wonder if this maybe will give us some kind of a pattern because this unpredictability of the extreme weather, it really makes it challenging to think about what to do with that extension of the spring growing season. If you get a freak frost, it can really mess you up. So we need to think about a pattern that accepts the probability of weird late frosts and accepts that there may be a divergence between the last spring frost and when soil temperatures become appropriate. We gotta not move up the annuals maybe because we accept things are gonna be crazy and give that spring growing season extension to perennials, particularly those native to the region that are used to the drama that this region throws at us. And then after you get the annuals in, you start to think about maybe August and September as a production height point instead of July and August. Look, I was not prepared by how much I was going to bring in this September. In July, if you ask my family, I was very whiny because everything was coming in really poorly. My eggplant, in particular, was very disappointing. But this intense burst of vegetative growth through August and September, it ended up being a very high production year. I had more food come into the house than ever before. So that late growing season, that extended late growing season, September on, I mean, we get less sunlight. So production and growth are going to go down, but that increased warmth trend, the way the soil is staying warm and the weather is more predictable because a drought at least is predictably nothing going on. Maybe that will be the place to optimize as we think about food production in the decades to come. And I think this is worth thinking about because everyone talks about the growing season moving up, but that space at the end of the growing season, when we're traditionally starting to move towards interior spaces, I think it's less on our cultural radar as a possibility. That extended end of the growing season, really getting another burst out of the ground there, maybe starting carrots and roots crops then in like October to pull in May. That's an experiment I want to try next year. I didn't come up with it in time this year. I didn't take time to think about the growing season as a whole until I started getting ready for this. But of course, thinking about a big burst of growth in August, September, when the precipitation trends indicate we're going to have more droughts, it brings us back to the water story. So that gigantic increase that we're seeing across this region in winter and spring precipitation, we have to think about getting that into the ground. We have to think about storing it because we're going to be drawing from the groundwater in the summer. There's no way around it. I was definitely drawing from groundwater at my place this summer because that's our water source, and I was watering all the time. So these are big system changes. We all know the current agricultural system, it's not at a point of sustainability. We're losing soil. The precious topsoil of this region, of the growing stuff zone that's emerging, it's our most valuable resource, and it's not so easy to regenerate. And we're losing it. We're losing it at 10 times or more, so way more. It can be like 1,000 times more, the rate of soil generation. We need to be thinking big about how to change agriculture while still feeding people. So these challenging springs, those wet, cold springs like we saw this year and that we're likely to see, it felt so unusual this year. It was one of the coldest, wettest, longest, extended, damp, gross springs ever. The strength of perennials in that context and the importance of perennials to soil building, I think it gives us an important piece of the puzzle. We need to think away from soil exploitative models in agriculture and perennials. I can only hope they're going to emerge as part of a large scale solution. There are folks working on perennial grains, legumes, and oil crops. So, sunflower type plants, right? They're a friendly native group. You might want to check this group out. They're called Kernza, Kernza. They're doing test planting now for perennial grain. If you're interested in novel crops in potential solutions for large scale agriculture, that could be fantastic. If all you had to do was go in and mow and you didn't need to get anything out in the field in the spring, it could be a real game changer for the producer. Getting more of the abundant spring water into the ground, working the soil less at that time, it would help not only with summer irrigation, with water capacity through dry summers, it'll hopefully help stabilize river levels because a lot of the river level has to do with the groundwater, not just with precipitation, not with what's falling from the sky. Looking at 2022 as a model year, we saw weird stuff happen with the Mississippi, right? And thinking about agriculture in the GSC, how do we get food out to the rest of the country? If you want low carbon transport, you have to use water. If you want to have affordable transport for large volume goods, what are you going to do other than the Mississippi, right? And right now, of course, most people do that in the fall. You get the new staple crop shipped out in the fall. And I wonder if there won't be a shift there too, a cultural seasonal shift towards winter storage and spring shipment on a large scale. There are already plenty of people moving on that trend because they want to optimize their price point, right? But if we think about potential opportunities, storage infrastructure could be a big potential opportunity area. If the rivers are regularly too low by fall, if the Mississippi is going to make it where you can't run a full weight barge down there, this is really going to change the whole pace of the scene and the pace of the commodities market. It's something to think about for the future. We'll see how it'll go. And I've probably gone on long enough there. I want to address a couple of additional questions from folks. We have some folks from California who want to know about the outlook for the Bay Area, which that is a complicated question. I think that one of the things that people worry about in California in general and in the Bay Area in particular is going to be water. I don't think we need to worry about water too much for the coastal cities in terms of human level water needs, drinking. In Los Angeles, as well as in the Bay Area, desalination technology is really catching up to what people need. You might not be aware of it, but most people in the Texas Panhandle are drinking desalinated water from saline groundwater. On the coasts, there's work that's being done in Israel right now to evaluate concentrated brine impacts on marine life, and there is actually some hopeful news there. Many of us were concerned about city level desalination technology because of the potential impacts on ocean ecosystems outside of the city. But it seems like depending on the brine output location and structure, you can set up a system with very little environmental impact. I'll be continuing to follow those studies, but it's hopeful not only for getting people in the coastal cities obviously access to drinking water, but the fact that maybe we don't have to further burden those aquatic communities that are offshore. Drinking water, you don't necessarily have to be like in terror of it, but it's worth thinking that if we're going to have a different water infrastructure for those coastal cities, the water will be more expensive. And with the sea level rise, you're not talking so much about inundation there as you might be in the Gulf, like around Galveston. But there is a lot of potential for serious saltwater incursion all around the Bay Area, all around the Bay. If we don't have sufficient river outflow, which we know is a likely big problem because of the thirst in inland California, saltwater from the ocean could get pretty far up into the surrounding freshwater and soil systems in the area. It could pollute a lot of current freshwater and it could severely disrupt a lot of agriculture in the region. So it's an overall situation where even if we may not be looking directly at life-threatening impacts, there are big stressors on many systems in the area. It doesn't seem to me like an area where the average person can expect their quality of life to stay the same. I think it'll go down there more and faster than other places. So it's a question of building resilience and how you want to invest your resources. I think that it's good to stay grounded, to realize that wherever you are, if you want to dig in, there are things you can do to improve your chances and improve your quality of life and make reasonable, fact based responses to the changes that are coming. It's not worth getting too bogged down around it, especially not this time of year. And I'm gonna head out. To anyone else who is fighting this respiratory stuff, anyone with kids in school, it's been so crazy. So good luck and stay strong and good night.